Keanu Reeves arrived at his new villa. He expected a quiet morning. What he didn't expect was to witness a disturbing scene right in his own neighborhood. A wealthy man, blinded by entitlement, was cruelly mistreating his defenseless dog. But what this rich guy didn't know, his new neighbor wasn't just anybody, he was Keanu Reeves. And unlike most, Keanu wasn't the type to look away. A sleek black car cruised through the pristine streets of Silverwood, an exclusive neighborhood where every mansion was more extravagant than the last. Behind the tinted windows, Keanu sat in silence, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the leather armrest as he watched the world pass by. The crisp morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet retreat from the chaos of Hollywood. As the car slowed near the gates of his villa, Keanu rolled down the window, letting the cool breeze ruffle his dark hair. He had owned this place for over a decade, yet it had always been just an investment, somewhere on paper, not a home. But now, for the first time, he was here to live in it. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Patrick, his assistant. With a small smile, Keanu hit the call button. "Good morning, Keanu." Patrick's familiar voice came through, warm but professional. "Just checking in about the villa. The maids have been deep cleaning all week. It should be spotless, like a 5-star hotel by now." Keanu chuckled softly. "Appreciate it, Patrick, but you know I'm not looking for a hotel. I just wanted to feel like home." A brief pause, then a knowing smile in Patrick's voice. "That's exactly what I meant. A place where you can breathe, settle in, something personal, not just another hotel suite." Keanu gazed out at the villa as the car pulled in, picturing himself inside, actually living here, even if just for a few months. Patrick hesitated for a second before adding, "If you want, I can be on standby at the villa, just in case. Might make the transition easier." Keanu shook his head slightly. He had always valued his independence, even in the unpredictable world of Hollywood. "No need, Patrick. I've got a butler here, and I can handle things myself. But thanks, it means a lot." "Keanu, you never change," Patrick said with a quiet laugh. "But you know the deal, if you need anything, I'm here. Day or night." As the call ended, Keanu found himself smiling. The car rolled forward, the ornate gates swinging open with a low hum. The moment he had anticipated for weeks was finally here. Stepping out, he took in the sight of his villa for the first time, not just as a distant property, but as his home. It stood in elegant contrast to the sleek modern mansions around it. The Mediterranean-inspired architecture, the terracotta roof tiles catching the morning sun, the ivy-wrapped balconies, all of it radiated a quiet, old-world charm. As he admired the place, a man in a crisp uniform approached. Tall, lean, with graying hair and the composed air of someone who had spent a lifetime in high-end service. "Welcome, Mr. Reeves," he said with a slight bow. "I'm Melvin, your butler. The staff and I are honored to have you here. The maids are ready to assist with your luggage whenever you're ready to go inside." Keanu nodded in appreciation. Melvin was polished, professional, but Keanu wasn't ready to retreat inside just yet. The morning was too perfect, and something about this place called him to explore. "Thank you, Melvin," Keanu replied warmly. "I think I'd like to take a walk around the neighborhood first while it's still cool. Could you have my bags taken to my room and my clothes pressed and put away?" "Of course, sir," Melvin said smoothly, already gesturing to the waiting staff. But as Keanu took his first steps down the quiet, manicured street, he had no idea that his peaceful morning was about to take a very unexpected turn. "Author in the business world," Graham continued, straightening his posture slightly. "Wrote a book on wealth accumulation and success strategies. Perhaps you've heard of it. The Whitlock Principle, Turning Millions into Billions. It was quite the bestseller a few years back." Keanu gave a polite nod, though the title didn't ring a bell. He had met plenty of self-proclaimed financial gurus in his time, men who measured their worth in square footage and stock portfolios. But at this moment, his focus wasn't on Graham's supposed achievements, it was on the trembling dog still cowering behind its owner. Sounds impressive, Keanu said neutrally, keeping his tone unreadable. He had learned long ago how to navigate conversations with people like Graham: listen, nod, let them talk. But his gaze drifted back to the dog, Rusty, who flinched slightly whenever Graham shifted his stance. Graham followed his eyes again and let out a light-hearted chuckle, nudging the dog slightly with his foot, not hard, but enough to make Rusty scramble away from his touch. Like I said, a real handful. But, you know, dogs need discipline. Especially rescues. Gotta break those bad habits early, or they'll walk all over you. Keanu's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. He had seen people like this before, the kind who justified cruelty under the guise of discipline, who saw fear as obedience. He had no doubt that Rusty had learned plenty, but not in the way Graham seemed to believe. Rescues need patience, Keanu said, his voice even. And kindness. There was a flicker of something in Graham's eyes, a brief crack in the polished mask he wore. But just as quickly, he smoothed it over with another easygoing laugh. Ah, well, to each their own, right? He said, dismissively waving a hand. Anyway, if you ever need anything, local recommendations, a good glass of scotch, just let me know. Always happy to welcome a new neighbor. Keanu forced a small, polite smile. Appreciate that. Graham nodded, seemingly satisfied, then tugged Rusty's leash sharply. The dog yelped softly but followed, head low, as Graham turned to leave. We'll be seeing plenty of each other, I'm sure, he called over his shoulder before strolling away, earbuds back in, already absorbed in whatever important conversation he was having before. Keanu stood there for a moment, watching the man disappear down the street, then looked back at the villa that was supposed to be his peaceful retreat. It seemed peace was going to have to wait. Balance, but he recognized it for what it was, a calculated distraction. Graham wanted to steer the conversation away from Rusty, away from the thin veil of deceit that was rapidly unraveling before Keanu's eyes. Sounds like quite the event, Keanu said, his voice calm, though his thoughts were anything but. He had spent years in Hollywood, around people who wore masks so seamlessly they sometimes forgot where the performance ended and reality began. Graham was no different. The so-called mindfulness guru grinned, clearly taking Keanu's response as an acceptance. Oh, it'll be fantastic. You'll get to meet all the wonderful people in our little community. Plus, a bit of fun never hurts, right? Keanu's gaze flickered once more to Rusty, who stood frozen, ribs protruding, his fearful eyes darting between his owner and the stranger who, for a brief moment, had acknowledged his suffering. Fun's always good, Keanu replied evenly. But sometimes, it depends on who's having it. Graham blinked at the words, just for a second, but then that winning smile was back, as polished as ever. Exactly, my friend. Exactly. With that, he gave a final tug on Rusty's leash, turning to leave. The dog stumbled slightly, but obediently followed, his body tense, as if bracing for whatever came next. Keanu watched them disappear down the street, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. The villa was supposed to be his retreat, a quiet escape from the noise of the world. But as he stood there, the sun casting long shadows over the pristine sidewalk, he realized something. He hadn't even stepped inside his new home yet, and already, he had found something he couldn't ignore. Keanu's fingers paused over his phone screen, his body tensing instinctively at the sound. The whimper was faint, but unmistakable. His brows furrowed as he turned his head slightly, listening. It wasn't just a random noise from outside, this was close. Too close. Setting his phone down, he rose from the couch, moving toward the large windows that overlooked the street. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the polished wood floors, but Keanu's focus was elsewhere. His eyes scanned the quiet neighborhood, the pristine sidewalks, the perfectly trimmed hedges. Nothing seemed out of place. Then he heard it again. A soft, pitiful whine, followed by a low, almost inaudible shuffle. His jaw tightened. Stepping away from the window, he moved toward the front door. The peaceful silence of the villa was deceptive, masking the unease that had been simmering in his gut ever since his encounter with Graham and Rusty. Now, it had returned in full force. Keanu hesitated for only a second before pulling open the heavy wooden door. The bright morning sun greeted him, along with the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. At first glance, there was nothing unusual until his gaze dropped to the ground near his gate. And there he was. Rusty. The dog was curled up tightly against the stone pillar of the gate, his trembling body partially hidden in the shadow of the hedges. His ribs were even more prominent up close, his fur patchy and dull. He barely lifted his head as Keanu stepped forward, his big brown eyes filled with something that made Keanu's chest tighten. Fear. Exhaustion. Desperation. Keanu crouched slowly, keeping his movements measured and unthreatening. Rusty flinched but didn't run. Instead, he let out another weak whimper, as if torn between his instinct to flee and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time, someone wouldn't hurt him. Keanu extended a hand, palm up, his voice low and steady. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. You're safe." Rusty hesitated, his body still tense, but his nose twitched slightly, picking up Keanu's scent. His gaze flickered back toward the street, as if expecting to be dragged away again. Keanu's mind was already working. How had Rusty gotten here? Had he broken free? Had Graham let him go? Or had the dog, against all odds, found his own way to Keanu's doorstep? One thing was certain, Keanu wasn't about to ignore this. Not now. Not ever. Standing near the kitchen, polishing a silver tray with the same calm efficiency that Keanu had already come to appreciate, Malvin looked up as Keanu approached, immediately setting the tray aside with a polite nod. "Sir, is there something I can assist you with?" Keanu hesitated for only a second before deciding to be direct. He needed information, and Malvin, given his experience in high-end households, was likely to know more than most. "I need to ask you about one of my neighbors," Keanu said, his voice low but firm. "Graham Whitlock. What do you know about him?" Malvin's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Whitlock is a respected figure in this community. Well-connected. He hosts events for the neighborhood and presents himself as a man of wisdom and discipline." Keanu crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "That's what he wants people to see. But what's the reality?" Malvin exhaled slowly, glancing toward the windows as if ensuring they weren't being overheard. "I have no direct dealings with the man, but I have heard things from other staff in the area. There have been whispers, sir. Concerns. Especially about the way he treats his dog. Some say he disciplines too harshly. Others claim to have seen injuries, unexplained weight loss, but no one speaks openly. Mr. Whitlock is influential, and this is a place where reputations matter." Keanu clenched his jaw, his worst suspicions confirmed. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who crafted perfect public images while hiding the truth behind closed doors. But this wasn't just about hypocrisy, this was about a living, breathing animal, suffering in silence. "Has anyone ever reported him?" Malvin shook his head. "Not to my knowledge. People here tend to handle things quietly. And, well, Mr. Whitlock has a way of ensuring that problems disappear before they reach the authorities." Keanu's grip tightened on the edge of the counter. He had seen enough. He wasn't going to be another bystander in Graham Whitlock's carefully curated world. "Thank you, Malvin," he said, pushing off the counter. "That'll be all for now." Malvin gave a respectful nod. "If I may, sir, be careful. Men like him do not take kindly to being challenged." Keanu met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "Neither do I." With that, he turned, his mind already set. This wasn't just about investigating anymore. It was about stopping Graham Whitlock. Were lined with perfectly curated art pieces, expensive but impersonal. The furniture, while undoubtedly high-end, was arranged more for aesthetics than for actual living. Everything about the space felt performative, like a showroom rather than a home. Keanu's sharp eyes swept the room, taking in the guests mingling with glasses of champagne in hand, their conversations filled with polite laughter and empty pleasantries. The kind of crowd that thrived on maintaining appearances. But his focus wasn't on them, he was scanning for Rusty. Then, across the expansive living room, he spotted Graham. Dressed in a tailored linen suit, his salt and pepper hairstyle just so, he was in his element, holding court with a group of admirers who hung on his every word. His laughter was warm, his gestures animated. A man of influence. A man who knew how to control a room. But where was Rusty? Keanu's jaw tightened as he moved further inside, offering polite nods to those who recognized him, but keeping his interactions brief. His goal was clear. Finally, he saw him. Rusty was in the backyard, confined to a small, decorative enclosure near the garden. The dog's body language was unmistakable, low posture, tail tucked, eyes darting anxiously. He looked exhausted, defeated. A group of guests strolled past without a second glance, chatting about the catering, the wine selection, the stock market, anything but the shivering animal in the corner. Keanu clenched his fists. He needed to get closer. As he stepped toward the patio doors, Graham's voice suddenly cut through the air. "Keanu. There you are, my friend." Keanu turned to find Graham striding toward him, that signature charming grin plastered across his face. "I was just telling everyone how lucky we are to have a legend like you in the neighborhood. Come, let me introduce you properly." Keanu forced a tight smile, shaking Graham's outstretched hand. His grip was firm, controlled, but he could feel the subtle strength behind Graham's handshake, an unspoken power play. Keanu didn't flinch. "Appreciate the warm welcome," he said evenly. "Seems like quite the event." Graham beamed, gesturing grandly to the lavish surroundings. "Only the best for Silverwood's finest. We take pride in our little community, don't we?" Keanu's gaze flickered toward the backyard again. "I see you brought Rusty out for the occasion." A brief pause, so brief most wouldn't have noticed it. But Keanu did. Then, Graham let out a good-natured chuckle. "Of course. Thought I'd let him get some fresh air, be a part of the celebration. He's still adjusting, you know. Rescue dogs can be quite the challenge." Keanu held his gaze. "Yeah. They need a lot of care. Patience. Kindness." Another pause. This one longer. The moment hung between them, unspoken meanings woven into the air. Then, Graham clapped Keanu on the shoulder, his smile unwavering. "Exactly. You get it. Always knew you were a good guy, Reeves." Keanu didn't react to the touch, didn't break eye contact. But deep down, his resolve hardened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. To the secluded space he had seen from his balcony earlier, the hidden section of the yard, deliberately screened from view by dense ornamental bushes. If Rusty was anywhere, it was there. Keanu moved carefully, his steps silent against the polished floors. He glanced back toward the party. Graham was still engaged in conversation, gesturing animatedly as he entertained his guests. Good. That meant he had a small window of opportunity. He reached the side door and pressed the handle slowly, easing it open without a sound. The air outside was slightly cooler in the shade, and the scent of damp soil mixed with trimmed hedges filled his senses. As he stepped out, he immediately heard it again, a faint whimper, followed by a rustling sound, like movement against gravel. Then he saw him. Rusty was curled up in the farthest corner of the enclosure, partially hidden behind a wooden structure that looked like an old storage shed. The dog's posture was painfully submissive, his head low, ears flattened against his skull, his frail body pressed into the dirt as if trying to disappear into the ground. A heavy metal chain was attached to his collar, its length barely allowing him to move more than a few feet. Keanu's breath tightened in his chest. This wasn't just neglect. This was abuse. He crouched low, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. You're safe." Rusty's body trembled violently at the sound of Keanu's voice. He flinched as if expecting a blow. Keanu's stomach twisted. How many times had this poor animal been hurt? How long had he lived in fear? Keanu extended his hand slowly, palm up. Rusty hesitated, his dark eyes flicking between Keanu's face and his outstretched hand. Seconds stretched into eternity as the dog remained frozen, caught between instinct and hope. Then, cautiously, Rusty inched forward. His thin nose twitched as he sniffed the air near Keanu's fingers. "That's it, buddy. Take your time." Keanu remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as Rusty made the smallest movement toward him. The chain rattled slightly as he shifted, a painful reminder of his captivity. Keanu's fists clenched involuntarily. "This isn't right. This can't continue." A sudden burst of laughter from the party made Rusty flinch again, shrinking back into himself. Keanu exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew he couldn't just grab the dog and run, not yet. This had to be handled carefully. If Graham realized what was happening, there was no telling what he'd do. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of dried jerky he had grabbed from the kitchen earlier. He placed it on the ground near Rusty, then withdrew his hand slightly, giving the dog space to decide. Rusty hesitated. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and sniffed the jerky before cautiously taking it into his mouth. Keanu felt the tension in his chest ease, just a little. It was a start. But he had to act fast. He wasn't leaving this house without a plan. And he sure as hell wasn't leaving without Rusty. Keanu discreetly made his way to the secluded side of Graham's property, where dense bushes hid a grim sight, Rusty, chained to a pole, weak and malnourished. The dog trembled, his eyes dull and fearful, his ribs painfully visible. There was no food, no water. Keanu's heart clenched at the cruelty. Spotting a garden hose, he instinctively reached for it, but Rusty recoiled in terror. That was all Keanu needed to know. Graham had been using it as a punishment. Instead, Keanu cupped water in his hands, letting Rusty drink at his own pace. As the dog hesitantly accepted the kindness, Keanu whispered, "You're safe now. I won't let them put you through that obstacle course." Before he could do more, a voice interrupted. "Lost on your way to the restroom?" Graham sneered, stepping from behind the bushes, his fake charm replaced with barely concealed irritation. Keanu stood, positioning himself protectively between Rusty and Graham. "What the hell are you doing to your dog?" he demanded. Graham repeated his usual excuses. Rusty was a rescue, difficult to train. But Keanu wasn't buying it. The dog's condition spoke for itself. "Then why adopt him?" Keanu pressed. Graham scoffed. "It wasn't my idea. My daughter wanted a cute puppy, but I saw an opportunity. A rescue dog made me look good. The media ate it up." His voice was cold, detached, as if Rusty were a prop instead of a living being. Keanu's disgust deepened. "So, once he stopped being useful, you stopped caring?" Graham shrugged. "He's ungrateful. Won't learn. A waste of effort." Keanu's jaw tightened. "This ends now. Rusty isn't competing in that event." Graham laughed mockingly. "Go ahead, tell the neighbors. They all know. They stay silent because of my influence." Realizing how deeply the community had enabled Graham, Keanu knew he couldn't rely on them. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. But without concrete proof of abuse, the authorities couldn't act immediately. Graham smirked. "What a waste of time. If you want the dog so badly, take it. He's useless to me now." Keanu didn't hesitate. He unchained Rusty, replacing the heavy metal restraint with a softer leash. As they stepped through the garden, the party continued just beyond the shrubs, music, laughter, and conversation oblivious to the cruelty that had been unfolding in their midst. Guests watched as Keanu left with Rusty, whispers trailing behind him. Back at his villa, Keanu wasted no time. He instructed Malvin to prepare a warm bath and get supplies, dog food, grooming tools, and a soft bed. He called Martin, a trusted friend who ran an animal shelter, arranging for Rusty to receive medical attention the next day. As Rusty cautiously explored his new surroundings, Keanu reassured him with quiet words and gentle touches. The dog's fear was still present, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. That night, as Rusty curled up on his plush new bed, finally warm and safe, Keanu sat beside him, stroking his fur. "You're never going back there," he promised. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog, it was about standing against cruelty and exposing the truth beneath Silverwood's polished facade. And Keanu wasn't backing down.